15 beloved classic films that were almost very different. Imagine Marilyn Monroe as Holly Golightly, or Star Wars starring a green alien named Han. These weren't wild pitches, they were almost real. These 15 iconic films were nearly unrecognizable disasters. The razor-thin margin between the movies we love and the versions we never saw reveals just how fragile cinematic immortality truly is. One bad studio note, one mechanical failure, one stubborn director's stand, that's all that separated cinematic gold from forgettable garbage. Today, we expose the alternate realities that nearly robbed us of the classics we can't stop watching. 1. The Wizard of Oz, 1939. The blonde Dorothy who almost was. Studio executives hated Over the Rainbow. Let that sink in. The most iconic song in film history was nearly cut after a preview screening because MGM bigwigs thought it slowed the story and would bore children. Producer Arthur Freed had to threaten to quit to save it. And that wasn't the only near disaster. MGM desperately wanted box office darling Shirley Temple, not awkward teenager Judy Garland, to play Dorothy. Only when 20th Century Fox refused to loan Temple did Garland secure the role that defined her career. In L. Frank Baum's original book, Dorothy wore silver shoes, not ruby slippers. The change happened solely to show off Technicolor technology, a last-minute decision that created one of cinema's most iconic costume pieces. MGM's head of production complained throughout filming, "It's too slow. Cut the farm stuff. Get to the damn witch faster." They wanted to trim the entire Kansas sequence to under 5 minutes. Even the shift from sepia to Technicolor when Dorothy opens the door, now considered one of cinema's most magical moments, was a relatively late production decision. Early plans called for the entire Oz sequence to be shot in sepia like Kansas. The Oz we know and love existed on a knife's edge of executive decisions that nearly resulted in a blonde Shirley Temple skipping down the yellow brick road in silver shoes, never singing Over the Rainbow in a mostly sepia-toned Oz that jumped straight to the action. Thank God someone said no. 2. Casablanca, 1942, when Bogart almost wasn't Rick. "Here's looking at you, Ronald Reagan." Those words nearly became reality. Warner Brothers actually announced Reagan for the role of Rick Blaine in a January 1942 press release. The studio even considered Dennis Morgan before production delays made Reagan unavailable due to military service. Reagan would have played Rick like a Boy Scout, all surface heroism, no inner conflict. The cynical, wounded quality Bogart brought, Reagan couldn't fake that with a gun to his head. Even more shocking was the film's original ending. In early script drafts, Rick and Ilsa escaped together to America. Other versions had Rick sent to a concentration camp. Another draft concluded with Rick joining the Free French. The immortal line, "Round up the usual suspects," was added during filming by writer Howard Koch, not in the original script. In fact, the screenplay was being rewritten daily during production. Actors sometimes received new pages hours before shooting. The film's famous fog-shrouded airport finale was nearly impossible to shoot because the airplane was a plywood mock-up, and the airport was a soundstage too small for a real plane. The iconic scale effect using midgets in a cardboard airplane could have looked ridiculous with slightly different lighting. Nobody involved thought they were making anything special. Producer Hal Wallace later admitted, "If you asked anyone during production if we were making a film for the ages, we'd have laughed. We were just trying to meet our release date." Had Warner Brothers stuck with their original casting and ending choices, the most quoted movie in history might today be a forgettable Reagan wartime vehicle gathering dust in the archives. 3. Jaws, 1975, when the shark worked too well. The most expensive floating turd ever created. That's what one studio executive called the mechanical shark, nicknamed Bruce, that was supposed to be the star of Jaws. The 25-foot, 1.5-ton nightmare refused to work. It sank. It froze. Its skin peeled off in salt water. The hydraulics failed daily. Spielberg's original vision called for abundant shark footage, attacks in broad daylight, clear shots of the beast circling boats, and plenty of mechanical shark action. The production nearly sank before completion. Originally budgeted at $4 million with a 55-day shooting schedule, it ballooned to $9 million and 159 shooting days. Universal executives seriously considered shutting it down and dumping what footage they had on TV as a movie of the week. The movie was saved when Spielberg, in desperation, decided to show the shark as little as possible. Instead, he'd suggest its presence through John Williams' two-note theme and creative camera angles. "The shark not working was the best thing that happened to that movie," Spielberg later admitted. "It made me create suspense the way Hitchcock did, where you don't see the threat, but know it's there." The film's most famous line, "You're gonna need a bigger boat," wasn't even in the script. Roy Scheider improvised it after seeing the shark for the first time. It was a running joke on set about the undersized production vessel they were using. If the mechanical shark had worked as designed, Jaws would have been a forgettable monster movie with abundant shark footage, not the masterpiece of suspense that invented the summer blockbuster and changed Hollywood forever. 4. Star Wars, 1977, the space opera that almost crashed. The film about the little dwarf walking around with a dustbin on his head. That's what British crew members mockingly called Star Wars during its catastrophic production. George Lucas's space fantasy survived one of Hollywood's most disastrous shoots, coming within days of being shut down completely. Early drafts read like bad fan fiction. The protagonist was originally Anakin Starkiller, a 60-year-old general, not a farm boy. In one version, Luke was a girl. In another, Han Solo was a green-skinned alien with gills. The Force? Initially called the Force of Others, and was a tangible substance stored in crystals, not a mystical energy field. The production was a disaster zone. Filming in Tunisia was hit by the country's first rainstorm in 50 years. The original R2-D2 constantly malfunctioned. Lucas fell so far behind schedule that he was hospitalized for chest pains and exhaustion. The first cut was so terrible that Lucas's friend Brian De Palma called it the worst movie ever. Editor Paul Hirsch recalled, "The first assembly was an incomprehensible, boring disaster." The film was saved in editing, where Lucas's then-wife Marcia Lucas, along with editors Hirsch and Richard Chew, essentially rebuilt the entire movie from scratch. They reordered scenes, created new transitions, and dramatically altered the pace. 20th Century Fox had so little faith in the film that they allowed Lucas to retain the merchandising rights, considered worthless at the time, in lieu of a higher director's fee. This decision inadvertently made Lucas a billionaire and changed how movies make money forever. The version of Star Wars that reached theaters was essentially rescued from the jaws of disaster through editing, music, and sound design. The film we know nearly didn't exist at all. 5. Back to the Future, 1985. When Marty McFly almost drove a refrigerator. Who's going to care about a kid, a crazy scientist, and a time machine? With that dismissive question, nearly every major studio rejected Robert Zemeckis' script. Back to the Future was turned down over 40 times before Universal finally took a chance. When shooting began, Eric Stoltz, not Michael J. Fox, played Marty McFly. Fox was always Zemeckis' first choice, but his family ties commitment made him unavailable. After a month of filming, Zemeckis made the unprecedented decision to fire Stoltz and start over, telling the studio, "I've just wasted $3 million of your money. I need to recast." The Time Machine? Originally a refrigerator, not a DeLorean. Steven Spielberg killed that idea. Worried kids might climb into refrigerators to play time traveler. Universal executives hated the title. Back to the Future sounds like a documentary about the history of time travel, one complained. Proposed alternatives included Spaceman from Pluto and Time Bomb. The incest subplot, where Marty's mother develops a crush on him, was considered too risque by studio executives who repeatedly demanded it be removed. Zemeckis and Spielberg refused to budge. When Universal finally saw the finished film, they predicted disaster. One executive's review, "The mother falling for her son is weird, the scientist is a lunatic, and there's a goddamn time-traveling car. This is going to bomb." It didn't. It became the highest-grossing film of 1985 and launched a franchise that has never needed a reboot. All because Zemeckis refused to compromise his bizarre vision of a kid, a scientist, and a time machine. 6. The Godfather, 1972, when the Don almost danced. Francis, Marlon Brando will never play the Godfather. Paramount executives repeated this like a mantra, fighting Coppola's casting choice with everything they had. They preferred Ernest Borgnine, Anthony Quinn, or even song and dance man Danny Thomas as Vito Corleone. The studio fought just as hard against Al Pacino as Michael. "He's too short," they complained, pushing for Robert Redford, Ryan O'Neal, or even Jack Nicholson instead. They were so unimpressed with Pacino's early performance that they nearly fired him 3 weeks into shooting. The horsehead scene was originally much less graphic. Animal rights concerns and budget limitations led to the revised scene where Jack Woltz discovers the severed head after throwing back the sheets. Paramount initially refused to budget for shooting in New York, pushing for it to be filmed entirely on Hollywood backlots. Only Coppola's insistence secured the authentic New York locations that gave the film its distinctive atmosphere. Most significantly, early drafts set the film in contemporary 1970s America rather than the 1940s period setting we know. This modern setting would have drastically altered the film's visual style, themes, and historical resonance. Coppola himself was nearly fired multiple times during production. Paramount executives were so unhappy with his work that they assembled a shadow crew ready to take over if they decided to replace him. Had the studio gotten its way, we'd have Danny Thomas making offers in 1970s polyester suits on a Hollywood backlot, not the period masterpiece that changed cinema forever. 7. Psycho, 1960. Hitchcock's shower scene almost stayed dry. This is so disgusting it's probably unshootable. That was Paramount's verdict on Psycho, refusing to finance what would become one of the most influential films ever made. Studio executives found Robert Bloch's novel repulsive and unmarketable. Hitchcock, determined to prove them wrong, mortgaged his own home to cover the $800,000 budget. The shower scene? Nearly invisible. Early storyboards show Hitchcock planned to film the murder entirely through suggestion and shadow, showing nothing explicit. And those screeching violins weren't in the plan either. The scene was originally going to play in complete silence. Janet Leigh wasn't Hitchcock's first choice. He pursued Lana Turner, Eva Marie Saint, and even wholesome Shirley Jones before casting Leigh as Marion Crane. Meanwhile, Anthony Perkins nearly lost Norman Bates to another actor because Hitchcock worried audiences might expect Perkins to play a villain. Censors freaked out over a toilet. The bathroom scene showing a flushing toilet was nearly cut because it had never been shown in American cinema before. The murder they could tolerate, but a flushing toilet? Scandalous. Paramount pushed hard for a happy ending that would have revealed the entire film as Marion Crane's nightmare. Hitchcock responded with two words that can't be printed here. The film's revolutionary marketing campaign, where no one could enter after the movie started, wasn't about artistic integrity. Hitchcock knew if people learned the star died 30 minutes in, the shock value would be ruined. If the studio had gotten its way, Psycho would have been a forgettable thriller with a dream sequence ending and no shower scene. Not the film that forever changed how audiences perceive safety. 8. It's a Wonderful Life, 1946. The Christmas classic that almost wasn't. A failed box office bomb saved by a paperwork error. That's the bizarre true story behind America's most beloved Christmas film. When released in 1946, It's a Wonderful Life lost over $525,000, a financial catastrophe that contributed to the collapse of Liberty Films, the independent studio Frank Capra founded. The film originated as a Christmas card. Writer Philip Van Doren Stern couldn't find a publisher for his short story, The Greatest Gift, so he printed it up and sent it to friends as a holiday greeting. One of those cards made its way to RKO Pictures, which developed it as a vehicle for Cary Grant before Capra acquired the project. James Stewart, fresh from the war, was psychologically shattered. Having flown 20 bombing missions over Nazi Germany, he suffered from what we'd now recognize as PTSD. "I'm not sure I remember how to act," he told Capra, his hands visibly trembling during readings. Critics dismissed the film as saccharine and manipulative. It was quickly forgotten until a monumental clerical blunder. In 1974, someone in the Copyright Office failed to process the renewal paperwork, accidentally releasing It's a Wonderful Life into the public domain. Suddenly, cash-strapped TV stations could broadcast it for free during Christmas. The film found its audience not in theaters, but in living rooms, where families stumbled upon it while channel surfing during the holidays. This bureaucratic mistake transformed a forgotten failure into a treasured tradition. Had the copyright been properly maintained, the film might never have become the Christmas classic we can't imagine December without, all because some clerk filed the wrong form. 9. Breakfast at Tiffany's, 1961, Holly Golightly's alternate reality. That skinny little flat-chested fashion model ruined my book. Truman Capote's infamous outburst about Audrey Hepburn reveals how differently he envisioned Holly Golightly. He wrote the character specifically for Marilyn Monroe, a sexy, damaged call girl with baby-fat cheeks and blonde hair cut like a boy's. When Monroe turned down the role on her acting coach's advice, Lee Strasberg warned playing a prostitute would damage her image. Hepburn stepped in. Capote was furious, complaining his tough call girl had been transformed into a pixie. The original Holly was nothing like Hepburn's elegant waif. In Capote's novella, she abandons her cat in an alley and leaves for Brazil, never reuniting with the narrator, who isn't even named Paul. There's no rain-soaked kiss, no romantic resolution, just a melancholy story about a woman unable to form attachments. Moon River nearly got axed after a preview screening when a Paramount executive declared, "That song has to go." Hepburn stood up and said, "Over my dead body." The song stayed and won an Oscar. The screenplay originally included explicit references to Holly's profession as a paid companion who received $50 for the powder room. Studio censors forced these references to be gradually softened until they became the vague arrangements seen in the final film. What survived on screen barely resembles Capote's gritty novella. If his vision had prevailed, audiences would have seen Marilyn Monroe as an explicitly portrayed prostitute who abandons her cat and any chance at love, not the romantic fashion icon that launched 1,000 dorm room posters. 10. Alien, 1979, the space horror that changed gender. A last-minute gender swap created cinema history. In Dan O'Bannon's original screenplay for Alien, Ellen Ripley didn't exist. Instead, the character was a man simply called Ripley. The script included a note that the crew is unisex and all parts are interchangeable for men or women, revolutionary for 1979. Late in pre-production, director Ridley Scott made a decision that would change action cinema forever. Make Ripley a woman, but change nothing else. No rewriting dialogue, no softening the character, no romantic subplot. We just changed he to she, Scott explained. We didn't modify anything else, which was revolutionary at that time. Fox executives freaked out over the film's marketing. The tagline, "In space, no one can hear you scream," was deemed too cerebral. Their alternative? The painfully literal, "There is a terror in space that cannot be escaped." H.R. Geiger's biomechanical xenomorph design disgusted studio heads, who called it pornographic and disturbing. They pushed for a more conventional alien monster until Scott threatened to walk. The actor's terror during the chestburster scene? Completely genuine. Scott deliberately kept them in the dark about what was about to happen. Their looks of horror are real reactions to the blood-soaked alien puppet bursting through John Hurt's prosthetic chest. Financial limitations accidentally created the film's most effective technique. If we'd had more money, you probably would have seen much more of the alien, Scott admitted. Budget constraints forced me to rely on suggestion and shadow, which ultimately made for a much scarier film. If Scott had followed the original plan, we'd have a male Ripley battling a conventional monster in a film that explained everything, not the groundbreaking horror that made Sigourney Weaver an action star and changed cinema forever. 11. Titanic, 1997, the epic that almost sank. Can we just have the ship hit the iceberg now and be done with it? That's what one Fox executive allegedly asked as Titanic's budget hemorrhaged past $200 million. At the time, the most expensive film ever made. The studio seriously considered shutting down production entirely. James Cameron fought constant battles over the film's central romance. The studio kept pushing me to focus more on the ship and less on the love story, he recalled. They didn't get that audiences needed characters to care about to fully experience the tragedy. Leonardo DiCaprio wasn't the original Jack Dawson. Matthew McConaughey was set to play the role before Cameron made a last-minute switch. Meanwhile, Gwyneth Paltrow was his first choice for Rose until Kate Winslet bombarded the director with daily messages explaining why she deserved the part. Test audiences rejected the original ending where Rose tossed the diamond overboard while treasure hunter Brock Lovett watched in angry disbelief. Viewers turned against Rose, seeing her act as spiteful rather than symbolic. The scene was reshot to show Lovett's gradual understanding. Even the film's signature song faced execution. Cameron actively opposed "My Heart Will Go On," insisting he didn't want a pop song over his closing credits. Composer James Horner secretly recorded a demo with Celine Dion anyway. When Cameron heard it, he immediately changed his mind. Fox executives demanded Cameron cut the film to under 3 hours, arguing audiences wouldn't sit through anything longer. Cameron refused, threatening to quit. His gamble paid off when the 3-hour and 14-minute epic became the highest-grossing film in history, a record it held for 12 years. If the studio had prevailed, Titanic might have been a Matthew McConaughey historical disaster movie without the love story, signature song, or proper ending, a forgettable spectacle instead of the phenomenon that made teenage girls see the same movie 20 times in theaters. Rapid fire round. 5 more classic films that almost looked completely different. The Shawshank Redemption, 1994. Tom Cruise almost played Andy Dufresne before Tim Robbins got the role. The beach reunion scene was nearly cut to save money. Test audiences complained it was boring and too long. Marketing wanted to rename it Prison Life because Shawshank Redemption was awkward. It tanked at the box office before finding immortality on cable TV and VHS. Gone with the Wind, 1939. Bette Davis rejected Scarlett O'Hara, calling her unsympathetic. Clark Gable only took Rhett Butler's role after MGM paid his divorce settlement. Early drafts killed off Scarlett in the final act. The Burning of Atlanta was filmed before Vivien Leigh was even cast. Frankly, My Dear, I Don't Give a Damn required special permission from censors and cost the studio a $5,000 fine. The Exorcist, 1973. The subliminal demon faces were almost removed as pointless. The spider walk scene was filmed but cut due to visible support wires. Audrey Hepburn turned down the mother role when they wouldn't shoot in Rome. The demon voice was recorded by Mercedes McCambridge while she was bound to a chair drinking raw eggs and whiskey. The pea soup vomit was chosen after thick oatmeal and vegetable soup failed to look disgusting enough. Sunset Boulevard, 1950. Mae West and Mary Pickford both rejected the Norma Desmond role. Montgomery Clift abandoned the Joe Gillis part weeks before filming. The famous opening with the floating corpse narrator was a desperate last-minute fix. The first Hollywood preview was so catastrophic that Louis B. Mayer told director Billy Wilder he should be tarred and feathered. Paramount nearly shelved the film permanently after industry backlash. Silence of the Lambs, 1991. Gene Hackman originally owned the rights but abandoned the project, finding it too disturbing. Michelle Pfeiffer was offered Clarice Starling but couldn't handle the moth scene. Sean Connery turned down Hannibal Lecter, later calling it his biggest career mistake. The studio dumped it in February, Hollywood's trash month, expecting it to fail. It swept the Big Five Oscars despite being a horror film released in the movie calendar's death slot. Every movie you love was one dumb studio note away from being a disaster. These 15, they survived. Barely. What saved them? Usually one stubborn creative refusing to compromise. Spielberg insisting on a beach reunion, Hitchcock mortgaging his house, or Hepburn defending Moon River with Over My Dead Body. Sometimes mechanical failures and budget limitations forced ingenious solutions, like the malfunctioning shark in Jaws or the limited alien appearances in Alien. The classics we can't stop watching weren't inevitable. They were rescued from the brink of disaster by people who fought for their vision when everyone told them they were wrong. Next time you watch one of these films, remember, you're not just seeing what made it to the screen, you're witnessing what survived the Hollywood meat grinder of bad ideas, budget cuts, and executive meddling. If you enjoyed this cinematic near-miss tour, smash that like button and subscribe for more Hollywood stories that almost weren't. Drop a comment telling us which alternative version would have been the biggest disaster.